Now, the living world is organized by 5 major themes that unify and explain biology as a science. Number 1, evolution. Number 2, the flow of energy. Number 3, cooperation. Number 4, structure determines function. And number 5, homeostasis. We've already touched on some of these, but let's talk about each one in more detail. The first biological theme is evolution, and this can be simply defined as genetic change in a species over time. Evolution is the result of a process called natural selection. Consider, if you will, a population of an individual species, and within that population, of course, you have several individuals. While these individuals, as a given species, will share the same DNA, their DNA will be slightly different. Now, some of these individuals are going to go ahead and have advantages that allow them to be more adept at escaping predators, be more adept at finding food or shelter. And ultimately, these advantages will give these individuals more time for reproduction, therefore producing a larger number of offspring. Now, keep in mind that while you have a number larger of offspring being produced by certain individuals who have advantages, if you go ahead and you consider the overall population of genetic information, what you're going to see is that those individuals who have advantages are going to go ahead and have their DNA over time represent a larger percentage of that population. And hence, this is exactly what you see with evolution. What we have here is a genetic change in a species over time. When we talk about a genetic change in a species, we're talking about genetic changes in a species' DNA, whereby individuals who are fittest or who have advantages are going to have their DNA compose a greater percentage of the overall population as time proceeds. We also have something called artificial selection. This is actually accomplished via breeding. This is where we as humans are going to go ahead and breed certain organisms together to produce unusual or new combinations that you don't necessarily normally find in nature. For instance, take a look at these pigeons right here. We have here an example of artificial selection, whereby here we have 3 images of pigeons, all the same species, but they have been bred to go ahead and actually show or represent different traits. You can see here, especially on the middle figure and on the right-hand side, that we have some very unusual looking pigeons here. And again, these are accomplished specifically through breeding. Artificial selection also is frequently used in agriculture. The next theme is the flow of energy. All living organisms require energy to power their bodies. One of the main sources of energy for all organisms on the planet is the sun. Ultimately, the sun is going to go ahead and power ecosystems. Now, as part of this process, plants are going to capture energy via a process called photosynthesis. And ultimately, those plants will be fed upon by other organisms, again, passing that energy on from the sun through plants to other organisms. Let's go ahead and take a look at the example to the right. What we see here is energy flow through ecosystems. Number 1, we have a variety of different organisms in this example. We have grasses, which are being fed upon by mice, which are fed upon by snakes, which are fed upon by hawks. These different types of organisms can be classified differently according to how they actually get their energy. Number 1, you have organisms that are considered producers, those that are actually producing their own food or their own energy, and those in this particular case would be the grasses. You also have consumers. Consumers actually have to get their food and their energy via consumption through feeding activities. So those would include the mouse, the snake, and the hawk. You can further divide those consumers into a variety of categories. For instance, you can go ahead and divide them according to what they eat. For instance, the mouse is considered a herbivore because it's feeding on plant material. It's actually feeding on a producer. In contrast, the snake and the hawk are considered carnivores because they're feeding on animal matter. Now, what we have here basically is a food chain, grass to mouse to snake to hawk. And what you often can go ahead and call this is not just a food chain, but the fact that we have several trophic levels or feeding levels. For instance, you would consider grasses to be your first trophic or your first feeding level. Your mouse would be the second trophic level, your snake would be the third trophic level, and finally your hawk would be the fourth trophic level. We also have a group of organisms called decomposers, and these decomposers are going to be composed of bacteria and fungi, and they're going to literally take dead or decaying organisms such as the grasses, mice, snakes, and hawks, and they're going to go ahead and break them down. They're going to break them down ultimately to nutrients. They're going to take organic material and break it down to inorganic material. Now, what you see here actually is a pyramid of producers, herbivores, and carnivores. And notice that you have a large percentage of this pyramid being represented by producers, a smaller percentage being represented by herbivores, and yet a smaller percentage being represented by carnivores. This is an energy pyramid, and it's showing you that when you're dealing with higher trophic levels, you have lower amounts of energy stored in them. Basically, as you move from the lower trophic levels up to the higher trophic levels, you're going to be losing energy at each step of the process. Basically, what you have is a situation where not all of the producers that actually exist are going to be consumed. Some of them might die prior to them being consumed. In addition, when you have, for instance, herbivores feeding on producers, you're going to have a situation where the mouse, for instance, will eat some of the grasses, but some of that material will not be able to be digested, so it will go ahead and be defecated out. Well, that material that's defecated out is no longer available for higher trophic levels. Hence, as you move up your pyramid, your energy pyramid, you have less and less energy being available for higher trophic levels. Hence, that's why it actually looks like a pyramid. The next theme is called cooperation. Cooperation specifically between or among organisms, and this is often critical for their own evolution. Symbiosis is going to be a situation where you have two different species that are going to be living in close or direct contact with one another. And there are different types of symbioses. Some of these symbioses can be very positive for some species, and sometimes they can be negative for some species. One such example of a symbiosis that is positive for both species that are living together is called mutualism. In this example right here, we have protection from ants for this particular plant species in exchange for nectar on acacia trees. Basically, what you have here is a situation where the ant is going to protect the acacia tree from other things that could potentially feed on it. And in exchange, the plant will actually provide nectar to the ant. Is that structure determines function. Biological structures are well suited to their function. Take, for instance, this hummingbird clearwing moth that has a long tongue to reach nectar. If it did not have such a long tongue, it could not get down into the corolla of the flower to actually reach the nectar. When this moth actually flies from flower to flower, it's going to actually perform pollination. And hence, the structure here is very important for the function. Without the long tongue, it cannot go ahead and receive its own food and also pollinate the flowers. Now, this structure determining function is true at every level of organization. Remember, we've already actually discussed this. We discussed it specifically in relation to enzymes and the fact that enzymes have a specific shape active site and that only certain types of substrates will be able to bind. Again, if you have the right shape, you can make it work. The next theme is homeostasis, again, which we've briefly discussed. And this is where living organisms try to maintain a relatively stable internal environment, such as this hippo trying to maintain its water balance. And maintaining homeostasis requires a lot of energy and signaling back and forth between cells. There are several theories that unify biology. First, we have the cell theory. Second, the gene theory. Third, the theory of heredity. And fourth, the theory of evolution. Let's first consider the cell theory. Back in 1665, a gentleman named Robert Hooke was the first to discover cells. He used a very rudimentary microscope powered by candlelight to actually illuminate the image to the upper right. What you see in the upper right basically is what is called cork. What you have here would be a cross-section of a woody stem of a plant. And what you see here basically would be the individual cells that you have composing that woody stem. Now, a little bit later in the 1670s, another gentleman named Anton van Leeuwenhoek actually discovered single-celled life by looking in pond water. And if you go ahead and you look at the image at the lower right, you see one of those individual organisms, a single-celled organism, a protist, that is going to go ahead and actually be alive. It's an actual species of its own. Then a couple hundred years later, in 1839, you have work done by Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. And their work went ahead and determined that all living organisms are actually composed of cells, and ultimately that the cells are in fact the basic units of life. Again, because you can have single-celled organisms. And in 1866, another gentleman named Rudolf Virchow determined that all cells come from other cells. Now, as part of the cell theory, we have that all organisms are composed of at least one cell. The cell is the most basic unit of life, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. Those three premises compose the cell theory. And here in these diagrams, you can see single-celled organisms such as bacteria or protists. And also here we have cheek cells that come from a multicellular organism, such as ourselves. Next, we have the gene theory, which is the molecular basis of inheritance. Keep in mind that what an organism is like depends specifically on its genes. When we say what an organism is like, we're talking about the way it looks and the way a body functions. Genes are going to be packets of DNA. Basically, genes are located along DNA molecules. And the genome would be the entire set of DNA instructions that is going to be found within a cell. So the genome is all of an organism's DNA, whereas individual genes are going to be found and linked or associated with specific characteristics of an organism, the way it looks or the way the body functions. Here we have a diagram that illustrates for us the gene theory. Let's start off with number 1. Here we have a human body containing over 100 different kinds of cells. We have several different types. Number 1, we have a macrophage, which is going to be involved in the immune defense system of an organism. We have a nerve cell, we have a muscle cell, we have an intestinal cell. Now, notice in each one of these cells, we have a nucleus. This nucleus is going to go ahead and be an organelle that is responsible for housing the DNA. Now, if you look at number 2 on this diagram, it says a human cell has 46 chromosomes containing some 3 billion nucleotides of DNA. So in this particular case, your DNA is going to be packaged. The DNA is packaged as something called chromosomes. And we're going to have 46 chromosomes in every single one of these cells. And consider the fact that all of these chromosomes are going to be composed of a lot of DNA, a lot of nucleotides, 3 billion nucleotides of DNA. This long purple structure that you see below is going to be a chromosome. It's a typical human chromosome containing about 1,000 genes arrayed along a linear piece of DNA. So this is one chromosome, or a representative of one chromosome, remember, of 46. And keep in mind here that we've got several different genes which are going to specify characteristics of the body on these chromosomes. These genes here are represented in the light blue regions. Now, number 4, each gene is composed of a sequence of several hundred to many thousand of DNA nucleotides and functions as a discrete unit of information. Again, that gene specifies a specific characteristic of a body or something specific as to the way the body functions. And number 5, all cells contain the same set of genes, but different kinds of cells use different genes depending on their function. The production of specific proteins determines what the cell is like. Next, we have the theory of heredity, or the unity of life. Back in 1865, a monk by the name of Gregor Mendel went ahead and was doing research with plants and determined that genes of an organism are in fact inherited as discrete units. At that particular time, he was not aware of the specific word genes. However, he did realize that information from parents was passed down to offspring as discrete packets of information. And it was later that actually biologists realized the chromosomal theory of inheritance, that you actually have genes being physically located on the chromosomes. The final theory is the theory of evolution, which has led to and produced the diversity of life that we see today on this planet. Back in 1859, Charles Darwin proposed that natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Remember, evolution is going to go ahead and be the change in the DNA of a given species over time. And keep in mind that natural selection, again, is basically survival of the fittest. Individuals with advantages in their population are going to have more time for reproduction, produce more offspring, and ultimately the DNA of those offspring are going to represent a greater proportion of the total DNA of the population than at a previous time. This, in fact, is what evolution is. Now, keep in mind that evolution, therefore, involves descent by modification. What we basically have is a species changing over time. Ultimately, as time progresses and as changes occur, what you could have is a situation where different populations of the same species could become reproductively isolated from one another. Basically, what happens is one particular population of a given species could undergo significant changes through evolution, whereby if it were to meet up with this other population, now you have had significant change in one population, but no change or little change in the other. These organisms might be reproductively isolated, whereby they cannot produce viable offspring any longer. And ultimately, what we have here is a case of what is called speciation, or the formation of a new species. Now, all living organisms are related to one another in a common tree of life, and it's through this speciation that we have produced this common tree of life. Here we have the tree of life. Ultimately, we're starting from the bottom, and we're going to go ahead and have very simple or basic units of life. Some of the first life on this planet was represented, of course, by bacteria, and then by archaea. And then we have the formation of protists. And protists gave rise to a variety of different types of organisms. In fact, protists gave rise ultimately to fungi, to animals, and to land plants. And here also we have animals. We have a variety of different types of animals. And again, via speciation, we have this great diversity of organisms. So we have a lot of invertebrates, and we also are going to have our vertebrates, such as our fish and our amphibians, crocodiles, birds, lizards and snakes, turtles, mammals, and also humans. Keep in mind, if you look at this tree of life, that crocodiles are more closely related to birds, actually, than to other reptiles. And this information is known based on examining DNA sequences and looking at how similar they actually are. Now, biologists divide all living organisms into 3 great groups called domains. So we have the first domain being bacteria, second archaea, and third, eukarya, of which we are a member. This diagram represents what is called a phylogenetic tree, and basically it shows you relationships among different organisms that we have on this planet. If you look at the very bottom of the diagram, you're going to go ahead and see that you're going to have original organisms, or the ancestral organisms, splitting off into different groups, splitting off into the three domains, into the bacteria, and then into the archaea and eukarya. Again, the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya are the three domains in which you're going to find your 6 kingdoms of organisms on this planet. Bacteria is going to represent, number 1, both a domain and a kingdom, and archaea also will do the same. Then, in the domain eukarya, you're going to have your protists, your plants, your fungi, and your animals. Now, when you go ahead and you lump bacteria and archaea together, they are both considered something called prokaryotes. And your other groups, your protists, plants, fungi, and animals taken together, will be considered the eukaryotes, meaning that they have what is called a true nucleus, which we will go into more later on. Now, also notice that interestingly, we actually are more similar to the archaea than the archaea actually are to bacteria. I also would like you to notice the protists. The kingdom Protista is going to go ahead and contain some of the simplest organisms with regard to the fact that they're single-celled, but at the same time, this particular kingdom is going to be the most diverse, more diverse than Plantae, fungi, or Animalia. And in fact, keep in mind that Protista actually gave rise to these 3 other eukaryotic kingdoms.